So I'm just going to talk about some applied research that we did on the Twin River fire and some lessons that we've learned on perhaps the recovery and resilience of our rangelands. Okay, so just a bit of a aside first. I've only been in my position for about 2.5 years, and since that time, a lot of concern has come up about fire on rangelands, and I'm only speculating here, but I think some of the reason for this might be because we're seeing more fires because it's a busy landscape. It really is an industrial landscape when you think about it. I think back to the recent fires. The Blood Tribe fire was started by a power line. This fire, the Twin River fire, was started by a combine. And we had a fire on the Sage Creek Grazing Reserve last summer. Sorry, the summer before that, and that was started from a highway. And so there's a lot of stuff going on the landscape. And one of the concerns is, so we're managing for healthy rangelands, and part of that is ensuring that there's a lot of litter, adequate litter, but this can contribute obviously to fuel loads. And perhaps climate change is playing a role. With regards to climate change, it's just physics, and what we do know is that warm air holds more water, and our climate is kind of on steroids, when you think about it. So warm air holds more water, so that means there's more evaporation, more drought, and when it does rain, it seems to rain more in a shorter period of time. So, for example, we had flooding in 2013, and 2015 we're in a drought situation. So perhaps climate change is playing a role. And just overall growing conditions. In the last decade, you've seen actually pretty good production. So this is from one of our benchmark sites in 1/4. And you can see that in the last 10 years, it's kind of a steady trend of increasing production. And perhaps that's just part of natural cycles, but it's also contributing to fuel loads on our rangelands. I think one thing that we forget a lot is that we've always been part of the landscape, and people have been living in North America probably since the Pleistocene, at least the last 10,000 years. And we really are a fire-adapted species, and a lot of historical accounts of the early explorers, as we call them, document frequent use of fire by First Nations, and that typically they set the grasslands on fire in late summer and fall, probably as they receded into their wintering areas, moved off the plains and into the foothills. So you have to think that the system is probably adapted to frequent fires at that time of year. And I think really, we learn from observation and intuition, and I think the First Nations understood that there is a relationship between fire and grazing, and we're certainly learning that now, again, in some of these areas where we do have free-ranging bison, such as the Cones of Prairie in Kansas. What's driving this? It's probably that when grasslands are burned, it exposes the soil, and that means that the blackened surface is the first thing to thaw in the spring. And really what drives herbivores in their grazing patterns is foraging efficiency, and they can just maximize their foraging efficiency in areas where there's no litter and really concentrated green vegetation. So I think in a lot of cases the First Nations were trying to facilitate grazing for bison. So fire is part of a natural disturbance regime, and we're part of that as well. In Alberta, we have Fescue grasslands, and this is just a statement by the late Dr. John Dormar. The Fescue grasslands are probably really a fire-dependent grassland. So, however, as we know, it's a different landscape now, and we can't really accommodate fire like we used to, just because of, like Lauren was talking about, competing interests on the landscape. So we have infrastructure concerns and safety and so on. So when we have a fire, from a public lands management perspective, or just even private rangelands, there's a lot of questions that come up as to, how can we accommodate this in terms of grazing, and what should be the policy regarding reintroducing grazing after fire. So that was kind of the impetus for the research that we did at the Twin River Fire. So the Twin River Fire, it occurred on the Twin River Grazing Reserve mostly, and this is located in the Milk River Upland. And so this is mixed-grass prairie, and unfortunately we've lost a lot of the mixed-grass prairie in the last British Bulk and Standard Plains, just because this is prime agricultural land. The mixed grass is kind of the sweet spot for growing crops, but the Milk River Upland and the Cypress Upland have remained, probably because they're a bit cooler and wetter, so the growing season is a little bit shorter in the Milk River Upland. So this is a picture of the Twin River Fire. So it's pretty easy to tell which way the wind was blowing that day. So this was under a Chinook wind. It occurred on the 10th of September in 2012, and the winds were blowing about 55 kilometers an hour. And what winds do to fire is it tilts the fire head, the flames forward, and that preheats the fuels and dries the fuels, and that's what drives the intensity. So it's just like a fire burning upslope, where you get that kind of conductive heating. And so this created kind of a unique opportunity to look at perhaps, what's the effect of different fire severities. So as you can see on the left there, we're in the center or the head of the fire, you get like a complete burn of all the vegetation. So that would probably be a severe burn as compared to the flank of the fire where there's more vegetation remaining. The plant grounds are more intact. There's still some of the club moss remaining, so maybe that's kind of a light or moderate burn. So I tried to incorporate this in some of the analysis that I did. So the way that we assessed recovery, so fire happened in the fall of 2012. We went off the next summer, 2013 and 2014, and just collected some information on composition, just doing transects and using a Dogmeyer frame, looking at species cover. We clipped some plots to look at productivity information, and from that we could tease out, look at litter recovery. And we also did range health in 2014. We had two different provincial rangeland specialists doing this in different years. We had two different assessment protocols. And, in the first year, we looked at kind of an unburned versus burn effect. So we did transects outside of the fire, and then we tried to cross-section a portion to get the flank, and then also in the center, and just looking at comparing unburned to burned. And also we did have some pre-burn information. So in 2009, we had Multistar did an inventory on the Twin River Grazing Reserve, and they looked at, just did a basic inventory. So we were able to go back to those transects in 2014 and reassess them, so we could look at, did the communities change because of the fire. So I hope this isn't too intimidating. So this is just an ordination of all the transects. So each of those dots represents a transect or a sampling point. And ordinations just show how are those points related by their similarities. So points that are closer together or more similar in their composition. And so this is all that's showing. And so this includes all the transects. And the first question I had is, okay, so what plant communities do those represent? So I went back in the data, and just classified them by their plant communities. So most of them are MGA 34s, and then we had two plots that were assessed in 2009 that were MGA 35. So what's an MGA 34? So these are all clay communities, clay range sites. So on clay range sites, we don't have a lot of needle grasses. It's mostly wheatgrasses and June grass. So an MGA 34 is kind of the lake Cyril community that you would expect on a clay range site in this eco district. And then MGA 35, it just has a greater dominance of Sandberg's bluegrass, which sort of, as an increaser species, indicates that it's perhaps a mid-Cyril community. So what's interesting is those two communities that were MGA 35s in 2009, by 2014, their composition had changed, so they were classified as MGA 35s. And these happen to be two spots that had been burned. So this is just looking at the effects of fire. So how did fire change the communities? So as you can tell, there's a noticeable difference between composition of so-called controls, pre-burn sites, or sites that we assessed outside of the fire, and also those the areas that were burned. And there was no difference between the head and the flanks. So what we conclude from that is that, perhaps the intensity didn't really have an effect, but just fire in general had an effect in changing the communities. So this doesn't really tell you how the communities changed. We do know that they're still the same classified, or same classification. So this one's just showing, what's the difference between 1 year post-burning and 2 years post-burning, and are those communities converging? And so there was still no difference between after 1 year of burning and after 2 years of burning. So it's showing that, recovery isn't really happening in that time frame. So it's still not significant. So, how did burning change the communities? And really the only change is that there's two plants that responded to burning, so that, negatively. So pasture sage and little club moss. So these are both fork species that are kind of omnipresent. Because fire eliminated them, the ordination picked that up as a change. So you can see in the top frame, you can see all the pasture sage, all the little frilly stuff, and the bottom frame. So this is the same plot, and just eliminated that plant. And the dominant species, like the dominant grasses, that those are your forage species. Most of them are all really unaffected by fire. So fire didn't change wheatgrass or June grass or needle and spreadgrass abundance at all. So that's how the communities changed. So we did look at range health in 2014, and so this is 2 years post-burning, and looking at the question, how did fire change range health? And I think most of you are familiar with range health, and it's based on 5 indicators. The first being ecological status. It looks at litter, plant community structure, bare ground, and weeds. And because the ecological status didn't change, the reason that range health was reduced was, loss of a structural layer in the plant community, and also a loss of litter. Again, and there's no difference between the flank and the head of the fire, so intensity effects weren't detected. And so litter, litter is an important component to the plant community, and one of the key things we look for range health. And because we have clipping data, we're able to look at, how is litter recovering. And so, as you'd expect, 1 year after burning, there's essentially no litter, because all the vegetation from the previous year had been burnt off. And then 2014, so two growing seasons, in the second growing season following fire, you can see a proportion of that production in 2013 became litter in 2014. And so, you know, that you can kind of project that trend and probably assume that, you know, not in 2 years post-burning are you going to have the same litter levels, but it might take 3 or 4 years, 5 years to build up that litter. And litter is actually pretty dynamic in these systems, so if you have a really productive year, maybe you can rebuild litter quite quickly. This figure is just looking at how did fire affect forage productivity. So overall, there was no year effect, but it was pretty close to significant, P 0.057. So although it's not significant, you can see that between 2013 and 2014, productivity is increasing, and part of that might be due to differences in growing seasons, but it's probably also a function of you reaccumulating that litter, which is promoting increasing productivity. And just overall, in general, you can see that fire did reduce productivity, probably because of the loss of litter. And again, there was no difference between, you know, the flank of the fire in moderate burning or the head of the fire severe burning. So intensity didn't really have an effect there. And then finally, bare soil. So with the loss of club moss, that's basically your ground cover species, and in these clay range sites. And because most of that was burned off, you know, there was quite a pronounced increase in bare ground. You know, it went from 3% to about 25%, and that didn't really ameliorate between 2013 and 2014. So you can probably expect that it's going to take a while before you're going to fill in those spaces. We don't really know what the fire, how long it takes for club moss to reestablish, or even kind of begs the question of do we want club moss? And maybe fire will promote, the perennial grasses, and maybe they'll fill in the community and replace some of that bare ground. So I think this would be a really interesting question to look at in the future. So just some general lessons that we can take away from these analyses is in this fire, the perennial grasses, they seem very resilient and they readily regrow. And this was independent of burn severity. So, kind of indicates that perhaps they're adapted to fire. And there's always some plants in the community that show a negative response, like club moss and pasture sage. Fire predictably reduce litter and increase bare ground. The bare grounds, litter will probably recover relatively quickly, and the question mark remains around bare ground. And so predictably also, because we lose litter, we lose some structural layers. So range health is affected by fire, and also forage fields will decline. We're seeing to decline a little bit because of fire. So some of the management recommendations, just some general ones that we generated from this study was, whenever you think of management, you always want to think about the principles of range management and, balancing forage supply with demand. Avoid grazing in key time periods and strive for equal utilization and provide adequate rest. But all these kind of just boil down to managing the intensity, timing, distribution, and frequency of use. So if you have a fire, you can probably expect that those areas that have burned, those are going to be selected for. So that might be your primary range, and you might want to adjust your slaughter rates to account for the burned area as your primary range. One of the biggest things we can do is change grazing regimes. Now again, plants tend to recover when they grow actively, and livestock they select for actively growing vegetation. So if you can change your grazing regimes, you can provide rest, for different plants at different times of the year. And so if you have a fire, maybe you just want to defer your grazing on that pasture and just allow those plants to regrow, reestablish, and generate carbohydrate reserves and do what they have to do during the growing season, and then maybe you can allow grazing. And then also just try to manage for selectivity by maybe you want to move your salting locations. I just want to stress that we like to think that we know a lot, but we really don't. So there is really no silver bullet management strategy. You always want to consider that maybe these fire grazing interactions were important. They were part of the landscape and its so-called evolution, and perhaps there's some synergies there, or there's some critters that like those habitats, those heavily grazed habitats. So there is no silver bullet, and maybe stochasticity or kind of a random approaches are good on the landscape. But so, however, from like a public lands perspective and generating some policies around grazing, some of the recommendations were, if you have a fire, perhaps we should rest it for a full growing season, and then you probably want to reassess that and look to see, did you have a plant community change, or how is the ecological status of that plant community? And if it looks like the dominant grasses are coming back, then you could probably cautiously reintroduce grazing after that period of rest. Just keeping in mind that recovery is not going to happen in 1 year or 2 years, but it might take 5 years to fill in all that bare ground, and it's a long-term process, and so we have to manage on those same time scales, and just remember the principles of range management.